Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Seeking Sustainability for Coffee Farmers and Consumers, which will be presented by Jeremy Haggar, Professor of Agroecology at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich. Jeremy has lived in Costa Rica, Mexico, and Nicaragua for 20 years, managing research and development projects that build the capacity of over 10,000 coffee farmers and 50 coffee producer organizations in ecological and entrepreneurial management. Currently, he leads a project on the trade-offs between sustainability and intensification of coffee production in Central America, focusing on the degree to which shaded coffee production may increase coffee farm resilience to climate change and market volatility. Today, Jeremy will present evidence of the environmental and economic outcomes for certified farmers and discuss some of the key opportunities and challenges this presents communities and the wider industry. As always, there will be time for a Q&A session after the presentation, so please submit your questions in the chat box on the bottom right corner of your screen at any point during the webinar. And so thank you very much for logging in, and Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you, Eduardo, for the introduction. So, yes, as Eduardo said, in the presentation, I will be concentrating on the sustainability characteristics of farms, of coffee production and coffee farms, and some of the economic trade-offs that farmers experience between being sustainable and being profitable. Now, across the globe, coffee is produced in quite contrasting what we call agroecosystems, so very different kinds of production systems. From an environmental point of view, this is important because coffee grows in areas that would naturally be tropical forest, and particularly are hotspots for biodiversity. So the impacts of coffee production can be significant in terms of the biodiversity sustained in particular areas. The world's two largest coffee producers, Vietnam and Brazil first, and then Vietnam, have focused on what we call intensive cultivation methods. A lot of their coffee is irrigated. They use high levels of fertilization, and it is pure plantations of coffee, just as sort of indicated in the slide there. These coffee plantations are highly productive and in most cases quite profitable. But particularly the expansion of coffee in Vietnam since the beginning of the century has been associated with with substantial levels of deforestation. However, there's another contrasting way of producing coffee, more like a more traditional way, producing coffee in forest-like conditions. Coffee as a shrub, in the wild in Ethiopia, it grows in the forest understory. And in some countries, it is still produced in similar conditions in Ethiopia itself, particularly Central America, Mexico, and the Andean countries down to Peru and Brazil. So this is a very contrasting environment, producing with a much more environmentally friendly or kind of production. So those are the two extremes of coffee production, but there are many variations between that. So on the left-hand side there, we have the coffee being produced without any shade, the pure stand of coffee bushes. Sort of the next step up the diversity scale is integrating a certain number of shade trees. Usually these shade trees are very heavily pruned to regulate the degree of shading on the coffee, and typically they are legume trees, so trees that can fix nitrogen to benefit the coffee. More diverse and developed coffee shade production systems can be found in other areas, integrating other species such as fruit trees and timber trees, or through to the almost forest-like shade systems where there's a large number of native forest species present shading the coffee bushes. As I said, the more diverse systems was how coffee has traditionally been produced. Some authors have calculated that the amount of diverse shaded coffee has declined substantially from at one point perhaps half of coffee production in the mid-90s to only about a quarter in 2010. Nevertheless, in some countries, particularly Guatemala, the vast majority of coffee is still shade grown. And those shade trees represent a substantial portion of biodiversity for those countries. A study by de Klerk found over 600 tree species present in coffee plantations as shade trees across the different Central American countries. So have substantial diversity of trees being maintained in that production system. Also, there are other varying environmental benefits of these different kinds of production systems. The shaded but more intensive legume shaded or polyculture systems with fruit trees may sustain somewhere between 10 and 20 tons of carbon per hectare, so maintaining moderate stocks of carbon, whereas the forest shaded coffee will typically have more like 30, 35, 70 tons of carbon per hectare. So maintaining stocks of carbon that would otherwise could be liberated into the atmosphere. Still, this is still less than a true forest, which would probably have somewhere between 100 and 150 tons of carbon. So, but nevertheless, these shaded forests, particularly the forest-shaded coffee production systems, are generating some greater environmental benefits than when there's just a pure plantation of coffee. Unfortunately, the economic benefits of these different production systems are in more or less inverse proportion to the environmental benefits. So the legume-shaded coffee production system there, well, in this study it was conducted in Guatemala some years ago now, but was only generating, so the legume-shaded coffee was generating about $1,000 net income per hectare, whereas the forest-shaded system was only generating about a third of that level of income. So obviously this generates a strong economic incentive for the farmers to move towards the more simple production systems, but which are generating fewer environmental benefits. So over the past 20 years, we've been conducting experiments and research on different kinds of coffee production systems to better understand their differences and their performance. So we have a 20-year-old experiment in Costa Rica comparing full sun coffee with shaded coffee systems. And this confirms, firstly, what we generally been suspected, that the full sun coffee, the coffee that without any shade trees, is more productive than coffee that is shaded under most production conditions. However, between the shaded coffee systems, the shaded coffee with the legume shade trees, or the legume trees that are fixing nitrogen, do maintain a higher productivity than coffee when it is shaded with timber trees or trees that are not fixing nitrogen. And this is of importance particularly for farmers who are seeking to manage with lower levels of inputs, that these legume shaded coffee systems maintain a greater level of productivity. And also, I should say, would not be particularly productive as a full sun system, which is dependent on higher levels of fertilizer inputs. These different intensities of coffee production also have effects in terms of the carbon footprint of production and the net, but also the economic return. So this in this study, I was comparing, well, I say the carbon footprint and the net economic return. So that is the NPV, the net present value of different coffee production systems, organic and conventional. And within the slide, the black boxes and the green circles are conventional systems with different levels of inputs, and the red triangles and the blue diamonds are organic coffee production systems. So overall, we can see that the carbon footprint of the conventional systems is higher than the organic, but also the most productive, economically profitable systems are also the conventional ones. So nevertheless, while there is in general a trade-off, there are a few organic systems that do give a reasonable economic return, but also have a lower carbon footprint. So it's not a total trade-off. There is some capacity to select systems that can at least have a lower carbon footprint but still be profitable. So going back to these coffee agroforests, what has been happening to them over the past few decades? And we've been tracking changes in one particular part of Guatemala since about 2000 on the Pacific slope of the volcanic mountain range in Guatemala, where the area in coffee production in these coffee agroforest systems has declined from about 50%, 56% of farm area down to 36%, and that coffee has been replaced with rubber production, increasing to over 20% of farm area during that time period. And this has caused some concern, both from the point of view of the availability of coffee, but also in terms of the environmental impacts of this conversion from coffee agroforest to rubber production systems, which we have been looking at in a subsequent project, the impacts of the coffee agroforest and forest patches against the rubber and to some degree the macadamia plantations that have been replacing those land uses. So to quickly summarize some of that, so if we compare the tree species diversity in those different production systems, not surprisingly, the rubber plantations and the macadamia have the lowest tree diversity, and the forest patches have the highest tree diversity, but the agroforest coffee is intermediate between those two, maintaining some of the tree species of the natural forest. If we look at another group, ant species, which are often used as indicators of biodiversity, again, the rubber has the lowest species diversity and the forest the highest species diversity, with the coffee production systems being somewhere intermediate between those two. But one of the bigger questions is, given the economic trade-offs for farmers in maintaining these high biodiversity systems, why do they still exist? And in some cases, farmers are using these coffee agroforest systems as part of their part of the reason for declaring their farms private nature reserves, which gives them protection also from poachers and other people invading their farms. And in some cases, they use that private nature reserve status to promote ecotourism type businesses. In other cases, farmers are sustainably certifying their coffee production as to gain a market recognition for those sustainable practices. Now, there are a range of different sustainability standards that, to some degree, may incentivize conservation. All of these standards, so rainforest, Fairtrade, organic, cafe practices, the Starbucks standard, and what's certified being some of the main ones, all of these standards seek compliance of the coffee farms against social, environmental, and economic criteria of good practice, although they differ quite a lot in where they put the emphasis across those different areas. All of the standards, to some degree, promote or recognize the use of shade trees in the coffee as being environmentally beneficial. And over the past 2 decades, these sustainability standards have moved from being a sort of a niche market of only maybe 1% of coffee under these standards to now being mainstream with, in the latest report from the State of Sustainability Initiative, slightly over a third of coffee production globally now being certified under one or other of these standards. So it is potentially having a substantial impact on the sector and on the environmental impact of the sector. Excuse me, sorry about that. So we conducted a study comparing certified and non-certified farms in 3 Central American countries, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. So farms with the 5 certifications there listed: Cafe Practices, Fairtrade, 6, Organic, Rainforest Alliance, UTZ, and non-certified farms. One of the first things we realized that different kinds of farmers were entering different certifications. So, for example, the Cafe Practices Starbucks certification only includes farmers that have their farms at high altitude, where the better quality coffee is grown, and also they tended to be better educated. The Fairtrade and Fairtrade Organic farms are all smallholders because that is a condition of fair trade. Rainforest Alliance farms were more generalist, more general in terms of covering a broader range of farm types, and as were the UTZ, although for some reason that is not apparent to us. For some reason, the UTZ farmers tended to be better educated and the Rainforest Alliance farmers less so. I'm not sure if that's a casual factor. But anyway, there's one important thing to realize is that when comparing these farms is that it's different kinds of farmers that are entering these certifications. And so we have to take that into account in the comparisons, which I'll indicate in a moment. One of the first questions to ask, of course, is whether farmers are in these certifications are obtaining better prices for their coffee. And generally speaking, the answer to that is yes. In most cases, certified farmers get better prices for their coffee than the non-certified farms. In particular, the organic fair trade farms were those who got the highest price. So that is farms that are both fair trade and then on top of that have an organic certification in addition. We also looked at some of the indicators of the environmental performance of these farms, such as the diversity of tree species on the farms. In this case, particularly farms with organic certification had the highest tree diversity, and also to some degree UTZ and fair trade farms. Also relating to the presence of trees on the farms is the levels of carbon stocks maintained by these farms, so sequestering carbon, keeping it out of the atmosphere, and contributing to global warming. And in this case, it was farms with the UTZ and the Rainforest Alliance certification that had the highest stocks of carbon. Another important factor, environmental factor in coffee production is the management of water contamination. The processing of coffee, for washed coffee, which is the higher quality coffee on the global market, potentially can generate a substantial water contamination from that washing process. So it is an important factor to qualify farm performance. In this graph, the easiest way to interpret it is on the left-hand side of the graph. There are a number of good management practices which are signified with yes, and on the right-hand side, a number of poor management practices signified with no. And then the degree of association with those good or bad practices of farms under the certification is indicated by the location of the mean location of the farm. So in this case, rainforest, UTZ, organic, and Starbucks farms tend to be associated with good practice in terms of managing water contamination, and the conventional or uncertified farms and fair trade with the lack of those practices. I should say that subsequent to this study, fair trade have reinforced their environmental part of their standards, including better management of water contamination sources. So we hope that issue has now been taken care of. Then we come to the performance of these farms in terms of their productivity and ultimately their economic performance. So for this, it is important that farms are matched to non-certified farms that are similar to those farms in their overall characteristics, such as the farm size, the level of education of the farms, and the altitude of farming. So in this case, we have the certified farms with the dark bars matched against non-certified farms that otherwise have similar characteristics. So in the terms of productivity, in statistical terms, what is significant is that the organic farms and the UTZ farms are significantly less productive than their non-certified peers, which presumably is would not necessarily be seen as beneficial. The cafe practice farms are the most productive, although statistically not significantly more than their non-certified pairs. When we then look at the result in terms of the net economic return to the farms, in this case, now the best performing farms are the cafe practice farms and the fair trade farms, both of which generate greater net income to the farmers than the farms against which they are matched. As you recall, I said fair trade farms are only small-scale farmers, and so whereas cafe practices is a mixture of small and large-scale farmers, so we cannot directly compare the data between cafe practice and fair trade, only against other farms of similar kind. Interestingly, although the organic farms were less productive, because they received the best price for their coffee in terms of the net economic return, that low productivity was compensated and they achieved the same net economic return. We think this is significant because the organic farms achieved that net economic return for a lower level of investment. And as for many smallholder farmers, the lack of capacity to invest in production is their chief restricting factor. To be able to achieve a similar economic return for less investment may be an important feature for those farmers. Unfortunately, the UTZ certified farms came in also with a lower net income because they were less productive, but also did not get a better price. I should say we don't think this is a result that seems to be specific to Nicaragua, where we think it also is to do with the fact that UTZ was the last certification to establish in the country and mostly has farms at lower altitude or in areas that are less favorable to coffee production. So as we're in Fair Trade Fortnight, I wanted to share some results more specific to fair trade from another study conducted by myself and a colleague looking at fair trade producers and producer organizations in fair trade across Indonesia, Mexico, Peru, and Tanzania. One of the first questions is, again, is fair trade providing farmers with markets that are paying better prices? Now, across this period, from 2011 to 2013, international coffee prices fell from $3 a pound to $1.25 a pound. One of the features of fair trade is that it provides a floor price of $1.40 per pound. So that's to say that that's the minimum price that fair trade sales should be made. So it's so as we can see in this graph, when prices are high, then fair trade is paying approximately the same price as the international $3 a pound. But as prices fall, then the fair trade price to most of these in most of these farmers is staying at about, bottoming it out in 2013 at about $1.40 a pound. And also in the cases where the organizations are making sales to fair trade and non-fair trade buyers, the fair trade buyers are consistently paying a better price than the non-fair trade buyers. So overall, we can conclude that at least when market prices are low, fair trade is offering better market prices than that available to the cooperatives, to these producer organizations otherwise. However, how does that translate to what the prices the farmers themselves actually receive? So again, in Mexico, Peru, and Tanzania, if we compare the farmers that are members of the fair trade organizations compared to farmers that are not members, there is a clearly higher price received by farmers who are in fair trade than those farmers who are not. However, in the case of Indonesia, the scenario was somewhat more complicated for two reasons. In this case, the control group of farmers was a non-fair trade producer organization who was also obtaining good prices for their coffee, indeed slightly better, than the price obtained by the fair trade cooperatives. Nevertheless, in both cases, the producer organizations, whether fair trade or not, were offering their members slightly better prices than that being offered by other buyers who were not associated with the organization. So this then moves on to have an impact on the gross income from coffee production by these farmers. So as may be expected, in Mexico, Peru, and Tanzania, the fair trade producers were receiving a higher gross income from coffee production than their peers who are not in fair trade, whereas in Indonesia, actually the farmers in the non-fair trade organization were attaining a higher income. This was also related to them having a higher productivity, and as you may note, the light green bars, the farmers are both fair trade and organic. So this obviously also restricts the levels that they're not allowed to use chemical fertilizers in their production, which would be available to non-certified farmers and would also contribute to their productivity and their gross income. So there are several factors that influence into whether a fair trade farmer, how the benefits they receive as against a non-fair trade farmer. And those benefits to fair trade farmers are not only in price, but also in that they receive more and better services. And this is across the board, whether it's in terms of coffee sales or credit, most particularly access to extension services, technical assistance about the agronomy of growing coffee, and also access to inputs to support coffee growing. The fair trade farmers across the board receive better access to all those services than the farmers in the countries where they were not fair trade. So this should be also contributing to better performance of fair trade farmers compared to non-fair trade. So in conclusion, well, what are points of conclusion? Though there are definitely trade-offs between environmental services or the sustainability of coffee production and the economic returns that farmers can achieve. Overall, coffee production, sun-grown coffee production is more productive, but it has a higher carbon footprint. For lower carbon footprint production with lower use of fertilizer, legume shade trees can help farmers maintain production, although it may still be less profitable than sun-grown coffee. The more diverse coffee agroforest systems generate greater environmental benefits, including sustaining some forest biodiversity and higher carbon stocks, although obviously less than a pure forest itself. The sustainability certifications do differentiate farms that at least have some better environmental practices. I should say none of the farms were better on all the criteria, but all of them were better on some of the criteria. And farmers in general do get better prices to recognize that better environmental performance. Within fair trade, under most circumstances, the farmers get better prices for their coffee, particularly when world coffee prices are low, such as they also are now. Whereas current coffee prices are at about $1.20-25 a pound against the fair trade minimum of $1.40. And also those farmers get better access to services that also should enable them to better sustain themselves in maintaining production and their position as coffee farmers and their overall livelihood benefits. Well, and thank you very much. Of course, I've talked about the sustainability of coffee. Of course, also it is important to consume that sustainably produced coffee. Otherwise, farmers won't be able to receive the economic benefits nor generate the environmental ones. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. That was really interesting, really clear as well. We are now moving into the Q&A session. So there are already a few questions that have been submitted throughout your presentation, during your presentation. So I will start by asking a question that was submitted by David. So what is the nature of the contamination that comes from the coffee washing?
Yes. Okay. So the coffee is it's called a cherry, and so there is the coffee bean is the seed inside, and around that seed there's a pulpy flesh, like on a very similar to a cherry. So that pulpy flesh needs to be removed, and part of that removal process requires or at least typically the coffee is fermented so that the fleshy part disintegrates, and then that disintegrated flesh can be washed away, and you just get left with the coffee bean. Traditionally, over many decades, that washing water is then contaminated. Well, that washing water is then contaminated with a lot of sugars and organic matter, which historically was just discharged into the nearest river. That then causes a lot of contamination in the rivers and what's called a high biological oxygen deficit. So it consumes all the oxygen in the water, and the rest of the life in the water is killed. Now, obviously, the coffee industry has been changing considerably over the past 2 decades to bring in better processing of that washing water and developing methods of cleaning those coffee berries without using water. So that both options exist. But obviously, that requires investment. Quite high investment in some cases, and farmers are not always able to make that investment or haven't had the incentives to do so. So it's still a problem, but it is one that is declining.
Okay, thank you very much for answering this. And the next question from Jacob. Do you think that using multiple certifications dilutes the message to the consumer?
Okay, well, I'm not a consumer expert by any means, but no, I don't. But I would say I don't. No, I don't think so. To me, well, at least to me, in many ways, although the certifications partially cover the same areas, they do have their strengths and weaknesses, and particularly in the perception of consumers. So I think the combination of certifications does have a value. So obviously, if you're certified fair trade, people have greater confidence that there's going to be social benefit from that coffee. If you add to that organic, then that is also ensuring the non-contamination of the environment. And if you put rainforests on top of that, then that's also a broader set of environmental criteria. So I think there are real additional gains from adding certifications together. Also, an important thing to be aware of for the fair trade plus organic is that fair trade mandates a minimum additional price for organic, I believe, of 30 cents a pound. So that's also a very important additional incentive to organic farmers.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question from Chloe. How is the fair trade floor price determined? Is this consistent across all countries which produce coffee despite differences in economies?
Well, the first part, yes, it is the same across all countries. It is differentiated by the type of coffee produced to the degree that there's the washed Arabica coffee. Well, first it's differentiated between Arabica coffee and Robusta coffee, and then between washed coffee and what's called natural processed coffee, because the the natural processing is sun drying the cherries and then depulping. It's a cheaper and easier method of processing. But yes, for the same kind of coffee, it is the same price across the globe. Those prices are negotiated within the fair trade system between the representatives of the fair trade producer organizations and the fair trade consuming countries. For example, there's in Latin America, there's the Latin America coordinator for fair trade who will represent the Latin American producers. For the UK, the Fair Trade Foundation will represent the buyers of fair trade products, the buyers and the retailers of fair trade products. So that's, yeah, the negotiations happen between those parties, but at a global level.
Okay, thank you very much. One question from Jason. Does coffee farming contribute to the global issue of illegal forest clearance and burning logging?
It has done. So it has not been very well documented, but certainly as the production of any commodity expands, it's going to be taking land that might otherwise be forested. Certainly in Vietnam, there is good documentation of forest clearance for the cultivation of the big expansion in coffee cultivation that happened in Vietnam in the early 2000s. There's also more anecdotal evidence of deforestation in some parts of Honduras, another country that has also substantially expanded its coffee production. Probably other parts of the world as well, but those are the two that I know of.
Thank you. And now a question from Adam. Why is certification so common in coffee but absent in most other products?
Yes, a very good question. I'm not sure whether I really know the answer. I guess yes. I mean, it started with fair trade, with the solidarity movement around fair trade during the 80s, I guess it was, 80s into the 90s. So there was one part of it was in fair trade and seeking to support farmers who are producing products consumed in developing countries. The other side of it came from the environmental movement, at least for Latin America. The realization by North American conservation organizations that the coffee plantations in Central America were critical for wintering migrant birds from North America. So that brought an awareness of the environmental importance of these coffee agroforestry systems, and then sort of those two things met together and became integrated. But quite why it happened with coffee before anything else, I'm not quite sure. I guess to some degree it's also a commodity. Much as we all need our morning cup of coffee, it's not actually essential to life. So I guess there's a degree to which consumers maybe were prepared to pay a little bit more for something that was to some degree a luxury commodity for those greater benefits.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we have time for one more question. So are there markets for coffee in producer countries? So in other words, is it usual for producers to also consume it locally, or are they mainly produced for export? So is coffee mainly produced for export?
Yes, so certainly the markets for coffee consumption in the producer countries are growing considerably. I mean, Brazil, for example, well, I think always has been a consumer country, but if I'm not mistaken, Brazil consumes about a third or more of the coffee it produces. So although it's the largest producer in the world, it consumes a great deal of what it produces. In other countries, it's certainly increasing substantially, particularly as sort of the global boom in, the image of coffee production has globally boomed. That is also happening in producer countries, to some more than others. I would say in some of the African countries, perhaps slightly less so. In Latin America, definitely it has. But also there is greater recognition. There's also demand for certified coffee in those countries. That is also growing, and many of the sort of local brands will also promote their sustainability credentials.
Okay, thank you very much for answering this last question. And now I would like to take a moment to thank all of the attendees for attending this webinar and also submitting these questions. And I will also like to remind all of you to not forget to record your attendance at this webinar in the IES CPT tool. And I would also like to remind you that this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and IES YouTube channel. So do follow this channel by subscribing. Remember also to do this, and so that you will be also notified every time that a new webinar is added to the channel. Something else that I also would like to remind to all attendees is to sign up for our upcoming webinar on the 11th of March. This webinar is climate change, whether you like it or not, and it will be presented by Chris Rapley. So thank you very much all for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this webinar. And of course, thank you very much, Jeremy, for presenting.
You're very welcome.